Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I'm so delighted to have Dionne Ford with us. And let me tell you a little bit about Dionne. She's the author of Go Back and Get It. She's a 2024 finalist for the Hurston Wright Foundation Legacy Award and co-editor of the anthology Slavery's Descendants. She's a 2026 New Jersey State Council on the Arts individual finalist. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Virginia Quarterly Review, Lit Hub, the Boston Globe, and Ebony, among other publications. And she's won awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Association of Black Journalists, and the Newswomen's Club of New York. She teaches creative writing as an adjunct at Fordham University and is editor of Lynchings in the North, an initiative of NYU's journalism program. Welcome, Dionne.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Estelle.
So we recently spent time together because Dionne was on a panel that I moderated called Double Exposure, Writing, Submitting, and Publishing in Literary and Mainstream Outlets at the 2026 AWP conference in Baltimore. And on that panel was Dennis Sweeney and Katie Henkin Robinson of Electric Literature. And our panel was standing room only. And it was just such an amazing experience to be a part of it and to share all the wisdom from the panelists and to contribute in the session. And then I asked the panelists to share some of their resources, and I put that together in a PDF, which is housed on my website. Right on the front page, you'll see the white lettering at estelleserasmus.com. So let's talk about Go Back and Get It. And this came out in 2023. So we're publishing buddies. My book came out in 2023 as well. And can you talk about what was the reason that you decided I need to write this historical / memoir / lyrical, beautiful book?
Thank you so much for giving me the chance to reflect on this. You know, I always knew some parts of my paternal family's history, and as soon as I learned certain things about that part of my family, I always wanted to know more. I was fascinated about it. My grandfather had told me a little bit about his grandparents when I was 12. And from that point on, I just wanted to know more about them. He had explained to me that they were an enslaved woman and the man who enslaved her. Honestly, he didn't really explain that to me, but I was able to figure that out from what he told me. And I just was fascinated, wanted to know more. I didn't really feel like I learned that much about enslaved people in school. I mean, there were sort of like the stock people that you learned about when it came to Black Americans, and that was it. And I didn't really feel like my family's history was reflected in that. And the more I talked to other people, it seemed like my history wasn't that uncommon. And so I was eager, very thirsty to know and learn more. And also I trained as a journalist. That's what I got my undergraduate degree in was, media studies. And the thing that always interested me in journalism was actually people's specific personal stories that reflect something wider about the world, or our culture. And so that made it even more of a something that I wanted to do. And then finally, I ended up marrying someone who's white, and we had two biracial children. And so that personal piece also reflected this family. Obviously, my family was created by choice. My great great grandmother, who'd been enslaved, her family wasn't created by choice. But I was very interested in looking at and collecting that family history that was forced through this perspective of choice.
So it's titled Go Back and Get It, but you also explain the reasoning behind what Go Back and Get It means. And on page 3, you say, I crisscrossed the country, uncovering the stories of the people in it, and a breach began to mend in me. There's a name for this kind of pilgrimage. The Khan of Western Africa call it Sankofa, symbolized by a bird in flight with its head craned backward and an egg in its beak. Sankofa means to go back and get it, or it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. That's so lovely. You do something which I think is very, very difficult to do in historical slash memoir books, and that is you're talking about a time in history, but you're very much present in the book as a memoir of your own journey and your own struggle and the things that you equated, including your own abuse, sexual abuse, and your own issues with addiction and things like that. And you're very open, you're very honest, but the weaving in of the writing must have been extremely challenging. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think the biggest challenge for me was that comparing my life to my ancestor who was enslaved and like, that's crazy. What right do I have to do that? So I really wanted to find places where the themes were similar and not be competition or whatever of like suffering, but just to reflect on themes that repeated in our stories and then to jump off what I learned about her to what it would bring up in me, or even what I learned about my great great grandfather.
Colonel, right? That was the Colonel.
Yeah. And what that would spark in me and my own journey. So that was pretty much the way I tried to handle that, but was thematically by looking at something I found out about them and revealing that, and then trying to connect that to something thematically in my own life that I may have been struggling with in the past or continuing to try and tease out, currently.
Yeah, and you do it so skillfully, the way you weave it in. It just really keeps you flowing. I don't feel like I have when I've read some braided or Memoir Plus, where it's just like you're jolted. It's just very skillfully done. What were some of the craft techniques you used to write this book as a journalist, as somebody who works and teaches that?
Oh gosh, I feel like I drew from so many other people, reading books that I loved and trying to think about, okay, how can I try and replicate to some degree what this, wonderful journalist did, or also even just like fiction, sometimes how maybe a piece of very dramatic or wonderful fiction that stayed with me. So, like, for example, this is going to sound crazy, but in the opening of my book, I really wanted to replicate the energy of the bell jar. And I know, like, it probably sounds like it has nothing to do with my book, but there's just something about that opening that is just so, well, it's energetic. And I think she started talking about being shocked, with electricity, actually.
When you start talking about when you go back, this is what you're going to find about yourself, that whole section.
So it's in the first chapter of having like the dissociative episode, which probably sounds like the opposite of energy, but I wanted the writing to feel very electrified. So craft techniques, I mean, I guess I'm just talking about books that were kind of on my mind and that I was thinking of. And also when it came to trying to capture things about my ancestors who I'd never met, I really was thinking a lot about Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns. I felt like she did such a great job in really bringing to life. She's following several different people, but bringing them to life in a way that we're really interested and there with them and wanting to see what happens next. So I felt like I was trying to reach for that kind of sense of needing to know what happens next with these people, like developing them as characters and hoping that people are leaning in and wanting to watch what happens with their stories. And then, of course, definitely the journalistic just craft of researching. And that was pretty much where this whole thing began, was the research, and then being able to reflect back what I found, ideally in some kind of interesting way that wasn't just sort of regurgitating the facts, but making them contextual to the story I was telling, and sometimes to the process of finding the information, because sometimes that was also important to the story, especially in terms of the difficulty that can be presented for Black researchers when there's slavery involved. There can be an added wall to information. And so sometimes I would bring in just the process of getting the information because it was germane to the story and a reflection of my ancestors and barriers.
What was one of those ways that you contextualized information that you found to make it appealing to the reader? Can you give an example?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way was I do talk about when my distant cousin and I go.
Monique?
Mhm. When we go to New Orleans and to Ocean Springs on a researching trip. And I do talk a little bit about preparing for the trip and how it's expensive. Like, we don't have access to endless money, and there's preparation that we need to do, and we have young children. And I felt like it was important to contextualize where we were in our lives and what a trip like that would mean for us, because you also do have to have access to money in many cases to be able to do this kind of in-depth research that we were doing. And so I also wanted to show that barrier that it can be to just accessing your own family's history, which felt very similar to this barrier to your family when you, as enslaved people, you're taken away from your family and you could never see them again, quite possibly. So it felt important to talk about that.
That's really helpful. And there's also a part in a book like this, it's sort of like a journey. You're journeying to get the information. So it's the story, almost like a mystery that we're following along with you. And I feel like sometimes the middle can be difficult, but in the middle, you had the experience of finding your white relatives who in some way attempted to take over the story from you and tell you what you were doing wrong. And I thought that was really interesting because there was almost a moment, and you end that chapter by saying something like, I'm going to go back to the grandmothers now. I'm going to let the women lead me. And it was just so propulsive, I thought.
Yeah, so it's so funny. That was the next example I was going to give was them. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so this was a situation which I did feel like really needed to be shown, meaning the process of finding them, the family that was connected to my family through slavery, descendants of the people who had enslaved my great great grandmother. And so we became, to a certain degree, researching partners. But the man was an art historian, was older than me, and did have certain ideas about what was the way to research based on his own experience and ideas about what was maybe appropriate to share publicly. I'll put it like that. And we differed in this way. My experience as a journalist was a different experience than his experience as an art historian. And I wasn't really interested in being so tied to how I conveyed my research. I just wanted to tell people what I found. And so I was feeling a little bit hemmed in that way. And yeah, so it was really important for me to take back the reins of how I was going to research, what I was going to research, and trust that I would find what I needed to find.
Can I just read that little section at the end? So, and he also told you about Tempe's son's lynching. He just kind of threw that at you, like, oh, here. And this was such a visceral experience for you to go through. And it was sort of like an aside that he threw it at you. And so you're writing here at the end. If someone in my family had died violently, I had a duty to shine the light of the truth on it. I shouldn't have to run it by anyone, and especially not the descendants of my family's enslavers. I definitely should not have to tiptoe around their feelings. I'd already wasted so much time strategizing about how to navigate a fucked up situation I hadn't caused, convinced that I had to bend to gatekeepers. I never responded to Joel's email about permission and historical evidence. It was time, I knew, for me to center my grandmothers, the only gatekeepers I would bow to. It was time for them to take back their story. That's so powerful, Dionne.
Thank you.
And I'm reading it to save your voice because I know that you're feeling a little hoarse.
Oh gosh. So I am feeling kind of hoarse, so I'm probably not going to read anything, but I want to thank you so much for reading that part because it was very powerful for me when I got to that understanding and was able to write that. And it's still powerful for me. When you read it just now, I felt energy. I invoke my ancestors every single day, and it means so much to me to know something about them, to have been able to record that in a way that will last and to hand that on to my kids and to center them.
And your kids are a little older now than when you wrote the book. How do they react? Did they read it? Or, I mean, they're still young, but did they?
Yeah, they both read it, and I think I can say that they were proud of it and they refer to it. I know my youngest daughter, who's in college, has written about it for papers and shared it with some professors. And I feel so grateful that they were also able to come along with me on this journey, like literally, and visit some places that were important to our family story, and that they know their third great grandmother and fourth great grandmother's names. And I think is grounding for them.
Yeah. And not to center them in the story, but do the stewards have a reaction as well?
I do know some of my Stewart relatives, and the ones that I've stayed in contact with, who've stayed in contact with me, have been very supportive. Yeah, absolutely. And that's been really also a nice addition.
That's lovely. What was the biggest challenge writing the story, writing Tempe's story, going through history, finding all this information, and then weaving in your own personal situation? What to you was the most challenging?
I think the most challenging thing for me was having courage, I guess, and trusting myself that what I felt really compelled to say was okay to say. I think that being forthright and open about the sexual abuse was a little bit challenging on this scale. But it felt really important to me because it is a problem that persists, not just for me or in any specific community across the board. And so I felt like it was really important to share as honestly as I could about that. But that was probably the biggest thing, was the fear of that not being well received.
Because at least in the book, you're still having dinner with that family member who abused you. I don't know if that has continued, but at least in the book, you said it did.
Yeah, I think I may have been referring to an earlier time, but that is the other thing with these intimate connections with people who have caused us harm, is that for me anyway, and for most of the people I know who have experienced it, it is not normally just a straight road, So I've felt different ways about my interaction with them at different times in my life. And I go back and forth. So trying not to cause myself further harm by judging myself is also a very big challenge. And I think that was another part of the challenge for me, was to try and focus on saying what I needed to say, doing this to put my ancestors' story into the stream of American history and culture, and try and give a voice to my grandmothers, whose, as enslaved women, historically had been taken out of our American conversation.
Yeah, well, you do that. And then you also go to I think it's the African American Museum, and cite some of the letters and the notations of these enslaved women and what they're going through. And I mean, that's a thread throughout this lack of agency that these women had. Despite all that, Tempe ends up being a landowner. Her daughter writes as well. And talks about recovering, right? And then you use that same language to talk about yourself. Is that an apt description of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think people find ways to resist personally, right? They find some ways to have personal autonomy. And I do think it's incredible that, yeah, that Tempe would be able to own property and then hand that property down to her daughters, who then handed it down to their children, and that my father would be able to live on that property. I think that's amazing. And that her daughter would be writing these little editorials and personal reflections in her newspaper, and that me, someone who always wanted to be a writer, would find them.
Tempe couldn't read or write herself. So her daughter, it's such a strength that her daughter was able to do that.
Absolutely. One generation removed from slavery. Yeah. I find that just so empowering. That's what it is for me. It's been empowering, and it's something that I can turn to when I'm feeling like I need some strength.
Yeah. What was the most supportive organization that you worked with as a journalist? We reach out to so many different places.
Gosh, I have to say, the historical societies were all so helpful. They want to help you connect. So, one that comes to mind immediately is Afrogenius, an organization that helps African descended people to find their history. They were amazing. So very helpful. The Schomburg Center had excellent, I wasn't thinking of them initially because my ancestors were in the South, but they had great research and access to it that did help me. Also, the Sankofa collection of the Meadville Lombard Theological School, that's like the Unitarian Universalist school. They also have a wonderful collection and they were really helpful. The Historical New Orleans collection, they were amazing. The Amistad Research Center.
If someone is trying to write their story, their historical story, how would you recommend they go about doing it? What would be the steps they should take, especially if they're not a journalist like yourself?
Yeah, if it's a family story connected to their family, I would recommend talking to the oldest member of their family as soon as possible and asking them as many detailed questions about their life, like what's your favorite memory? What's your worst memory? Just to get them talking about what it was like for them growing up. I think our living elders are our first line of connection. And I say that because that's how I had this story to tell. My grandfather shared something about our family's history in kind of a casual conversation while the two of us were the only two in the house and just spending some time together. So yeah, I would say spend some time with your elders and ask them about their lives.
And then how do you recommend they figure out the ways that their lives might mesh with their ancestors? How do you recommend them going to do that?
So I notice like usually people are writing, people already know what they want to get to. Like there's something that's calling them. And I would just recommend as much as possible being honest about that with yourself, letting that guide you. I've noticed a lot in some of my favorite books where someone will write an historical memoir, the catalyst is in the introduction. Like something happens and it sets them off. And usually, whatever that something is, gets written about in the introduction.
That's really interesting. So it's just on someone's mind and they just put it right there in the introduction, but that's really the catalyst of why the book came about. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that is exactly what I mean. I'm thinking about Henry Louis Gates Jr.'s memoir. It's about his family growing up in West Virginia. And he does talk about in the introduction driving around and his daughters, who were biracial, asking him something that made him realize they didn't really know about his family's history or something along that line. But he writes that in the introduction, and that's never returned to at all in the book, but it doesn't need to be. It's just him kind of summing up for you this thing happened, and now I went on this quest to capture my family's history. Now, he didn't have to do the research I did because he knew much more about it, but he had to do some. But yeah.
So this came out in 2023. Is there another Sankofa that you're going on?
You know what? Actually, maybe there is. So right now, I've been working on my second book, which was supposed to be my first book, a novel, and it is a like a coming of age novel about a girl who tries to escape her family dynamics and life by going to live abroad for a year in Brazil and kind of gets faced with all the same dynamics and situations in her new home. I lived in Brazil for a year when I was 16, And so I guess I am going back to get that story. This was the novel I was supposed to be working on in my MFA program. I did work on it some, but I also worked on my memoir. So
That's so cool. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me about this. Everybody, go back and get it.
thank you so much. This was great.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.